It brings me great pleasure to introduce Nnedi Okorafor, one of the most accomplished writers on the planet. A Nigerian-American African futurist writing spellbinding, galaxy-straddling works in visual media and narrative prose, Okorafor pushes far beyond our ordinary conceptions of speculative fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. You have surely read something she has written. She is, after all, the author of the Binti trilogy, named for the protagonist who attends a prestigious intergalactic school and who becomes an avatar of peace and understanding in a time of war. The novels are presently in development for Hulu. The trilogy of novels about the Nigerian albino Sunny, whose magical skills and passionate friendships are restoratively grounded in her home. These works, titled Akata Witch, Akata Warrior, and Akata Woman, just published this last January. The comic series LaGuardia, which grew partly from her experiences with the TSA, with the inevitabilities and ironies of pat-downs and state surveillance. The novel Who Fears Death, about Onye, a child with skin and hair the color of sand, who was born to be one thing and who sets out to learn what else might be possible or imaginable, a novel presently under development as an HBO series. The Marvel comics Wakanda Forever and Shuri, too. In sum, Nnedi Okorafor has written plays, short stories, scripts, novels, comic books, graphic novels, many of them drawing deeply from Nigerian culture and featuring Black girls as complex protagonists in an uncertain future. She is the brick and mortar of our symbolic surroundings. These works cover an impossibly broad emotional range, too. In Remote Control, published in 2021, we follow Fatima, a young girl who becomes Sankofa, the adopted daughter of death. She's the subject of grim folktales, a wanderer who brings terror to every doorway. For some time, Sankofa struggles to accept what she has become, and we watch everything around her falter or fail. We measure the bodies by the size of the piles. Glowing with the power of death, Sankofa's coming of age means that she understands and perhaps accepts who and what she has become, that her extraordinary capacity for violence and death keeps her, in a strange way, safe. And in the novel's final passages, as she comes to understand a dawning corporate conspiracy, she unleashes that capacity coolly and deliberately. The bringer of human endings, she alone can free her community. My daughter Maya, age 16, read Remote Control for her high school last summer. I asked her for a one-word review and she said, awesome, which is typical. I asked her for a second word and she added stunning. And then without prompting, terrifying. For this limitless body of work, Nnedi Okorafor has been awarded the Hugo, Nebula, World Fantasy, Locus, Lodestar, and Carl-branded Kindred Awards, and dozens of others. She was always a wonderful writer, even from her earliest days. Her very first novel, Zara the Windseeker, about a 13-year-old girl born with vines in her hair and the ability to fly, and who sets out to save the life of her best friend, won the prestigious Woye Soyinka Prize for Literature. Dr. Nnedi Okorafor, welcome to Brown University.
Wow, thank you so much. That was an amazing introduction. Wow. I think that the narratives that I've written, there's just so many, and it's kind of hard to like bring it all together. And as I was sitting and listening to the introduction, I was thinking about the themes and the ideas that I love writing about. And one thing about when I'm writing something, because I'm very much a unconscious, subconscious writer where I don't outline, I don't know what I'm going to write until I sit down and just start writing. But there's certain themes that come up every single time I've written something, and I've lost count of the number of books that I've written. There are a lot, but issues of identity is a big one. Technology, of course, nature being the ultimate technology. So the issue of surveillance is one that I'm pretty obsessed with for many reasons. Issues of body, and when I talk about how I started writing, you'll understand where that comes from. So issues of body, technology, inner strength, and then also Black women and girls. And one thing that I recently noticed, like in almost all of my works, is I like to write about Black women and girls who leave the path to go and create their own much more difficult path, but they're always leaving. And that's something that comes up even in my most recent novel, Noor, same thing. But when I started writing, because my journey to writing plays into what I ended up writing, because there was no way there was no way I could have known that I would be doing this. Like way back in the day, there were very few clues. I was even in college, I was a pre-med major, you know, and I thought I was going to become an entomologist. That's what I'd always wanted to be. I wanted to study bugs. I've always loved bugs since I was little. I've always loved bugs, wanted to sit down and study them and obsess over them. And that made me really happy. But, you know, that's really not what the universe had in mind when my path was being created. So really, okay, so let me just start at the beginning, because a lot of this explains a lot of what I would go on to write. So I'm Nigerian American. Both of my parents are from Nigeria. They're immigrants from Nigeria. They came to this country in 1969, and they weren't running from anything. They came here to get their education and whatever they could get from the United States, and then take it back to Nigeria and use it over there. So that was their intent. And so when they came here, my father studied medicine. My mom was a registered nurse, midwife, and went on to get her Ph.D. in health administration. So they were very medicine and medical oriented people. So when they were studying here, the Biafran War broke out. That's the civil war in Nigeria. And they ended up having to stay here. They didn't know they didn't know if anyone was alive or anything. So that was why they ended up staying here. And they lost contact with everybody. So when the war was over, they reestablished contact with family, everyone. And they started taking my siblings and me back to Nigeria to meet our relatives and our, kind of understand who it is that we are, what our culture is. So from a young age, been going to Nigeria, and not for vacation, not as a tourist, but as a Nigerian. We had Nigerian passports, and we had American passports and Nigerian passports. So we would go, and those trips were pivotal. So I didn't start writing until I was 20, and I'll get to that in a second. But those trips were pivotal. We met all of our relatives. We were curious. My sisters and I were all like 1 year apart, so we were very curious about the culture. We engaged with the culture. We engaged with the conversation. So all these issues of culture and politics, all those things were things that we engaged with very early on as kids, as young adults, and then as adults. So these trips were pivotal. They kind of we grew up in a very a somewhat racist, actually somewhat, why am I saying somewhat? A very racist community in the south side of the south suburbs of Chicago, called South Holland. So we were dealing with American racism. Then we go to Nigeria, and it would be a completely different everything, completely different perspective, Black country, where racism doesn't exist, but tribalism does, all of that. So it's like our perspectives were already broadened from an early age. So, and we engaged, and like I said, we engaged with it, because you could easily go and not engage with any of it. Just kind of be like, okay, I'm just going to stay in my hotel room. I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm not going to talk to people, all of that. But we engaged with it, argued, and, came to understand who it is that we were. So that was all very early on. And once again, like I said, I was very, I'm totally into the bugs. So those trips were all about the bugs and all of that. So fast forward a few years, and I'm in college. I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. Oh, and before that, my siblings and I were all athletes as well. So I played semi-pro tennis from the age of 9. I was always on the tennis court. That was my life. We toured. I saw the United States through the tennis courts of the country. And we were really good. We were like the Venus and Serena before Venus and Serena. So we understood the sport of tennis deeply. That's a whole other conversation. But and then also I did track and field. Both of my parents were also mega athletes. So that was, who I was. Like I had a very concrete idea of who I am. The engaging with culture early on, I understood that I was Nigerian American. Like there was like, from all the questions that I would add, all the arguments that I would have when we would go to Nigeria, and then also in the United States, also engaged with the culture as well. So by the time I was in my teens, I had a very strong idea culturally of who I was and how sloppy and messy that was and how confusing that could be, but also how exciting it was as well. And then there was the sports, which added a whole layer to things. And then, so we've got this whole cultural thing going on with me. And so by the time I went to University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, I was a pre-med major, thought I was going to study bugs. I loved, the one hint was that I loved reading. I loved reading anything that had a good story. And I didn't care about categories. So if it had a good story, it could be in mystery, it could be fantasy, it could be just fiction. I don't like saying realistic fiction because that has a fraught, that's fraught. But yeah, you know what I mean. So what people call literary, which that's also fraught. So yeah, if it had a good story, I would read it. I loved reading. So there was that. That was the only hint of what was to come. So fast forward to I'm in my freshman year at U of I. I have scoliosis. That was another thing. I was diagnosed when I was 13. It got progressively worse, but I was still doing all of my sports with no pain, no problem. Just my spine was in an S shape and nothing was helping it. So by the time I was a freshman at University of Illinois, I was on the tennis team, and the doctors did an x-ray and they found that my curvature was quickly getting worse, and it was not, nothing was helping it, nothing was improving it. No, the exercises, I wore a back brace for several years, which was really painful and stiff. So when I wasn't on the tennis court or the track, I had to wear this confining thing. So it was a weird contrast, that I was really used to, like being immobile and then super mobile. So by the time I was a freshman, they did this x-ray and they found that my curvature was getting much worse. And if I didn't have this spinal surgery to straighten it out and then fuse the spine, fuse some of the vertebrae in the spine, that I would be crippled by the time I was 25 and my life would be significantly shorter. So this was an easy decision to make. I knew what I had to do. They said that, okay, the recovery period was brief for this. Other athletes have had it. I'd be back on the tennis court or the track in no time. The only thing is that when you're dealing with the spine, there's a 1% chance of paralysis. So it was an easy decision to make. 1% chance of paralysis versus 100% chance of being crippled and having a shortened life. I knew what I was going to do. So I had the surgery and woke up about 9 hours later, paralyzed from the waist down, and they didn't know why. I was basically I was in that 1% of people who mysteriously react to the surgery in that way. So this was the moment. This was the moment where everything shifted. Either I could call it shifting, or I could call it locked into focus. Because when I was sitting in that hospital bed, unable to move, it did something where it was, how when a diamond needs pressure to become a diamond, it was like that, because that thing that was always there, because I was always a very imaginative kid, always, like that was how I was born, literally. But it was not something that I had any purpose for. It was just the thing that made me weird to people. But in that moment, when I was sitting in that hospital bed, my imagination just kicked in. It saved me, because there was a time, and it was in the first night, where it was dark. Like it was like I understood. It took a few days for me to get out of the grogginess of the morphine. But in that night, that was where I understood that I was paralyzed. And like, I literally couldn't, it's like half of my body was gone. I could not even roll over. It was just locked, you know? And so it was that night of understanding when everyone went home and I was by myself, where it was just dark. And in that moment, I had to like, I knew I had to do something, because I'm like, if I didn't do something, I'd go down this dark path. Like, so you could see that dark path, you'd go down that dark path and never return. And so that was when, I don't know, my mind just decided to start telling me stories. And the first story, and my stories have always started with characters. So this character was a woman who could fly. And when I look back psychologically, it makes sense. When you can fly, you don't have to walk. You don't need your legs. So that made sense. But just kind of thinking of these stories about her and like scribbling these little stories about her was enough to pull me from that dark path. It was just the joy of writing it in a physical sense. There's something about the physical act of writing the words and creating the words almost in an artistic way. You're drawing the words. So there's that focuses the mind and the eye. There's something about that, but also the telling of the story, the weaving of the story, the narrative, and how it just kind of like, once you start with that, and that was where the whole thing where I just start writing something and I don't know where it's going. It was like that, where I wrote this story about this woman. I had no idea where it was going. And it's almost like the story was lifting off the page. It was just lifting because she flies. That's what it does. So it was, that once I started doing that, and I didn't stop doing that, that was really what got me through those dark times. It's what got me through understanding that I had to do physical therapy and basically learn how to walk again. Like, the way that I walk now is not the way that I walked as, from a child, like from learning as a baby. I walked differently. I had to like literally learn. It's my memory of what I think walking is like. So I had to literally learn how to walk again. And that took that whole summer. And the sensation in my legs slowly came back. They don't know why. They didn't know it would. They just hoped. And gradually, like my parents, because my parents are very much about, being, you don't need something to, you believe it before it happens. You believe it hardcore, whether it can happen or not, you believe it. So we had to they put me in physical therapy even before I was supposed to be in physical therapy. So I'm doing these things when I can't even feel my legs. And then eventually the sensation started coming back. And so it was a very strange process. It was a very difficult process. It was surreal. I used my training from athletics to do that. But what I also came away with after that summer, because by the time I went from using a wheelchair to a walker to a half walker to a cane, and I returned to U of I that semester, no time off, because in my family, you don't take time off. I returned using the cane. But I also returned writing these stories. And so the first stories that I wrote when I sat down to think about these things, when I was, telling these stories, they were in Nigeria. They just, it wasn't a conscious decision. It was very much just the way it happened. I mean, that's where the energy was. Like those trips to Nigeria, they did something to myself and also my siblings. It wasn't just me. It was all four of us. Those trips did something to us. And so when I sat down and started mining these things from my mind, first place I went to was Nigeria. And so the first stories that I wrote were set there. Or there's so much, but okay. So I returned to U of I writing these narratives. By the time that semester was over, I ended up taking a creative writing class because a friend of mine looked at what I was writing and he was like, you need to take a creative writing class. I mean, this is good stuff. You're good at this. Learn how to structure it. And so I took the creative writing class. And I haven't stopped writing since then. Basically, I have not stopped writing since then. By the end of that semester, I was writing my first my first novel. I'm very much a product of university creative writing workshops. That was where I started writing. It was within writing workshops. So that's how it all started. And the first stories that I wrote were fantastical, you know, and they were like, and when I say fantastical, it wasn't something that I don't categorize them. I didn't categorize them as fantasy. Categories were not something that I even paid any attention to at all. Like, and it's very much the same way that I approach libraries when I go in there. I just find a good story. I didn't care if it was the adult section or the young adult section, which was how I ended up reading Stephen King's It when I was 12, which, yeah, that had its consequences. But I didn't look at categories at all. You know, that's how I approached my reading experience. So the way that I write, or the way that I started writing and still write, is the same way that I approached my reading experience. I didn't look at categories. But these stories that I was writing, and a lot of my first stories were based in realism, and like they were memoir. But the way that I would write them, people would read them and think they'd say this is fantasy. So, you know, that category was more kind of pushed on me than something that I was actively writing. And then, you know, at some point I just decided to embrace it and then just lean into it. So one of the things, like whenever we would go to Nigeria, because I was Nigerian American, one of the things that kind of always caught my eye, always caught my senses, were the cultural stuff, the cultural beliefs. And those cultural beliefs often were things that were mysterious or kept secret or forbidden, you know, and like, I loved all of that stuff. I just loved it. And the more mysterious and the more I wasn't supposed to know about it, the more people were like, no, we don't talk about that. The more that was said, the more interested I got. So like, even before I was writing, even before I started telling stories, I was into all of that stuff. I was into Igbo cosmology. I was into masquerades. My sisters and I, we were obsessed with masquerades. They would always harass us in the village. They would chase us, and we would always talk about the masquerades, and we just loved them. The masks that you'd find in the markets, we'd be obsessed with those. We'd want to know more about them. And then we'd always hit those walls of, you know, you're not supposed to talk about these, you know, you're a heathen and you need to be saved, you know, and that would make us even more interested. So those were things I was obsessed about already. And so once I started writing, I realized there was a freedom in writing. You know, I could write about those things that were forbidden, that no one was supposed to talk about. I could just have a field day with it. And so, and like me being Nigerian American, that American side had the distance from some of those things. So I wasn't afraid of things that if I were born and raised in Nigeria, I would be afraid, you know, like it would be pounded into my mind that I'm supposed to be afraid of those things. So a lot of that was not in my mind. So therefore I could just go in there and just have a field day with it. And I could write about it unabashedly. But I also, because I was Nigerian American, I'd have a knowledge of those things on a personal level that I could also weave into it. So it had these stories that I was writing had this weird flavor to it. So that was the beginning of it. Now the science fiction aspects came later. As I got older and started noticing whenever we would go to, because we'd stay in Lagos at first, and then we would go to the village. And the village was more rural. You'd have these beautiful homes there, but you wouldn't have any running water because the infrastructure wasn't there, or electricity. So you'd have a generator. And so I started noticing cell phones showing up in these kinds of places, which those kind of places already fascinated me to begin with, because there's things that were skipped over, and then you've got these humongous mansions, and but they're not functioning like mansions, and then they're in this jungle-like area, but it's really farmland. Those places fascinated me, like the most out of all parts of Nigeria. Those places, the village, my parents' ancestral villages, fascinated me the most. And so I started noticing cell phones showing up in these places, and I'd started noticing like it would be in like peculiar ways, like the palm wine tapper who was shimmied up the tree to tap the palm tree sap to make palm wine would be leaning back on the belt that was holding him up to be on his cell phone. And I'm like, that's really interesting. That's really, really interesting. And I wanted to write about those things, but no one was writing about those. No one was writing about those, that Africa, like I was seeing Africa portrayed as a place of the past, a place that foreigners go to visit. I wasn't seeing the perspective of the people there, and I wasn't seeing what I was seeing. I wasn't seeing that kind of speculation. What would this place be like in the future? If there's this like jumping over that infrastructure, jumping over certain types of technology, and then to have this amazing, portable handheld tech that connects you to the entire world and beyond. Like, how is that going to affect this part of the world? So I was obsessed with that idea, and I wasn't seeing it written about. So that was really how I came to start writing science fiction. And I'm going to read a little bit. I have Broken Places in Outer Spaces. This is a memoir. It's like a short. It's short. It's thin, but it's really the account of what I talked about, where with the paralysis and all of that. It's just basically, in a nutshell, it's my journey to becoming a writer. That's what Broken Places in Outer Spaces is. And I'm going to read this very short part here that kind of talks about where a lot of my science, a lot of my views on on speculative fiction and how I wrote it and how I write it came through in this short few paragraphs. I'm just going to read that really quickly. And this is chapter 8, and it is called, chapter 8 is called Rusted Robot. I remember how I used to be. On the tennis court, there were days when I could see through time. It happened most often when things got really heated. Something inside me would align. The tennis term for this heightened state of being is treeing. It is when you are playing out of your mind, when you can do no wrong, when you can make the universe yield to your very whim. I know it sounds intense because it is. When I treed, sometimes I could predict the future, not that far, about 1 second. I'd know exactly where the opponent was going to hit the ball because I'd see it happen right before it did. It was just enough time to make use of the knowledge. Even before I began to write science fiction, though I didn't know it, I was sci-fi. In those moments, my athleticism really was a superpower. Now, when I write about characters with abilities, the gift of flight, time travel, shape-shifting, I draw from my own experiences as an incredible athlete. And for these characters' conflicts and limits within the narrative, I draw from my experiences with and recovering from paralysis. So the way that I, all of these things, all of these experiences from my time, from the cultural parts where I would travel to Nigeria and meet relatives, all of that, and have these experiences, to my experience with paralysis and my experience with sports, like all of these things went into the way that I write what I write. And so once I started writing science fiction, it's like there was, I don't even know how to describe it. Writing science fiction allowed me to really speculate about, Blackness in a way that I couldn't have if it weren't, if I were writing even fantastical narratives. And I kind of want to talk about the categories that eventually I had to create, to make a long story short, just to summarize I didn't stop writing after once I started writing after the whole paralysis thing. I haven't stopped writing since. Like literally, I went about 8 years initially where I just wrote and enjoyed writing and just that discovery of storytelling. I knew I discovered the thing that I needed to discover about myself. Changed my major from pre-med eventually to rhetoric, which is creative writing at University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And for that 8 years, I was writing and writing. I wrote probably 4 or 5 full-blown edited finished novels, and none of them were published. And I wasn't thinking about getting published. That was not my, I wasn't interested in getting published at all. I was interested in just writing. I would literally spend a year or two working on a novel. And then when I'd finished it, I would just put it aside and start another one and just keep doing that. It was really great practice because I didn't have this whole thing of I didn't have anyone looking over my shoulder, and I got to experiment, and I didn't have anyone judging me. And so I got to experiment with a lot of different types of writing, a lot of different types of ideas, and see them all the way through. And I learned to be the judge of my own work. It wasn't like no one else would need it. I learned to not need anyone else to tell me that what I was writing was good. I learned to tell myself. So yeah, the whole publishing thing, if you have questions about that, ask those. That's a lot. But I have felt that, and especially in the last few years, that that the definition of what I was doing, it was like I felt like it was being missed. There were certain, it was like what I was writing was being squeezed into a category that people were familiar with, and those aspects that people were not familiar with were getting left out. It's like when you take something and there's a mold and you shove it into that mold, the parts that don't fit will be shaved off. And that's how I felt. That's what I felt was happening with my own work. And a lot of it was the parts that were being shaved off, I felt were the cultural aspects that people weren't familiar with, because I don't write in a way where I feel like I have to explain everything. I'll just throw you in there and then you've got to sink or swim. I feel like, anthropology research is where the explaining should be, not in my work. And also when it comes to point of view, like if the story is from a certain point of view, that certain point of view is not going to explain themselves. They're just going to be themselves. And yeah, so I just felt like these aspects were, these cultural aspects were not being acknowledged. And by not being acknowledged, I felt like whole layers of my work were being missed. And so that was why I felt I needed to come up with, there are 2 terms that I've recently come up with, probably in the last 2 or 3 years. I can't remember when it's happened now, but COVID has messed everything up when it comes to a timeline. But so African futurism, one word, no capital F, it's just one word. And then African Jujuism, which is also one word. And the reason why I'm always stressing it to be one word is that when it's one word, it's a thing. It's a thing. If it's 2 words, it's like something that can be, parts of it can be swapped out really easily and replaced with something else and become a different conversation. I don't want it to be a different conversation. Like if it's African and then futurism, it's 2 words, then you can easily get rid of the African part. And I saw that happening. I've seen people mess up the term, and then it's like when you have a hyphenated name, for some reason, they always drop the second half, or no, they drop the first half. And there's something kind of sexist about that. But yeah, so I don't like to have any kind of stuff going on. So it's one word. And it's important that it's one word. It's a thing, it's one thing. So African futurism is different. It's I'm sure many of you have heard of Afro-Jujuism or don't say that, Afrofuturism. African futurism is similar to Afrofuturism in the way that, and this is something I've written a blog post about it. So just go read the blog post. It's very simple. Read my blog post. Don't read anyone else's anything, because lots of people can have their own interpretations and they kind of get little things wrong that matter. So the strongest definition, and I created this definition, is my blog post. It's simple. So African futurism is similar to Afrofuturism in the way that Blacks on the continent and the Black diaspora are all connected by blood, spirit, history, and future. And I'm reading this directly from my blog right now. Like, it's all there. The difference is that African futurism is specifically and more directly rooted in African culture, history, mythology, point of view, and as it then branches into the Black diaspora. African futurism does include the Black diaspora. I shouldn't have to say that, but apparently I do. It does not privilege or center the West. African futurism is concerned with visions of the future, is interested in technology, leaves the earth, skews optimistic, is centered on and predominantly written by people of African descent, Black people, and it is rooted first and foremost in Africa. It is also less concerned with what could have been and more concerned with what is and can and will be. It acknowledges and grapples with and carries what has been. So that's the definition of that. And then African Jujuism is also important for a different reason, but it's also important. And the simple definition of that, and African futurism is science fiction. So not all of my work is African futurism. Some of it is. Probably, yeah, I'll just say some of it is. And some of it is both African futurism and African Jujuism. African Jujuism is fantasy. It's fantasy. African Jujuism is a subcategory of fantasy that respectfully acknowledges the seamless blend of true and existing African spiritualities and cosmologies with the imaginative. So the Nnedi script series, which is Akata witch, Akata woman, Akata witch, Akata warrior, and Akata woman. That series is definitely African Jujuism. My novel Noor is definitely African futurism. So these are two categories that I felt it very necessary to come up with, because it's all in my blog post. I'm not gonna get too far into it, but so these are the themes that the categories that I write in most frequently. I am free to write outside of those if I so choose, but that would be how you would categorize my existing work. Remote control would be African futurism. Who Fears Death is both, it's a blend of African futurism and African Jujuism. Yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of how all of this is. Yeah, so I've talked a lot and I can keep talking, but I really want to let me just read a little bit, because I was going to read a little bit of Binti as well. And Binti is also definitely African futurism. And I'm going to just read the very beginning of Binti. Yeah, because I think, she's a good, the series, still, she is a good example of African futurism. So this is the very beginning, so I don't have to explain anything. I powered up the transporter and said a silent prayer. I had no idea what I was going to do if it didn't work. My transporter was cheap, so even a droplet of moisture, or more likely, a grain of sand, would cause it to short. It was faulty, and most of the time I had to restart it over and over before it worked. Please not now, I thought. The transporter shivered in the sand and I held my breath. Tiny, flat, and black as a prayer stone, it buzzed softly and then slowly rose from the sand. Finally, it produced the baggage lifting force. I grinned. Now I could make it to the shuttle. I swiped ojitse from my forehead with my index finger and knelt down. Then I touched the finger to the sand, grounding the sweet-smelling red clay into it. Thank you, I whispered. It was a half-mile walk along the dark desert road. With the transporter working, I would make it there on time. Straightening up, I paused and shut my eyes. Now the weight of my entire life was pressing on my shoulders. I was defying the most traditional part of myself for the first time in my entire life. I was leaving in the dead of night, and they had no clue. My 9 siblings, all older than me except for my younger sister and brother, would never see this coming. My parents would never imagine I'd do such a thing in a million years. By the time they all realized what I had done and where I was going, I'd have left the planet. In my absence, my parents would growl to each other that I would never set foot in their home again. My 4 aunties and 2 uncles who lived down the road would shout and gossip amongst themselves about how I'd scandalized our entire bloodline. I was going to be a pariah. Go, I softly whispered to the transporter, stamping my foot. The thin metal rings I wore around each ankle jingled noisily, but I stamped my foot again. Once on, the transporter worked best when I didn't touch it. Go, I said again, sweat forming on my brow. When nothing moved, I chanced giving the 2 large suitcases sitting atop the force field a shove. They moved smoothly and I breathed a sigh of relief. At least some luck was on my side. So that's the beginning of Binti, a girl leaving and going on to her own path and leaving the planet. But it's a solid example of African futurism. And you can see it in that it's very much grounded in the setting where she is. You know, the story starts and you have a very strong sense of place. You have a very strong sense of who she is. It's not really told to you, but you get that feel just from her being her and her doing what she's doing in the way that she's doing it. You get all of that, and that, I think that's really solid African futurism. So I'll stop there, and I think it's a great time to open it up for some questions.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Nnedi. I'm so glad that you shared a kind of longer history of your work as a writer and your time in African futurism. I wanted to ask you about, as a way to start the conversation and to give you a breather, I wanted to ask you a question about something that you put on Twitter the other day. And it was a brief quote just about a day ago. And you said, "To whomever needs to hear this, parentheses, including me, close parentheses, keep going." And I wonder if you can talk to us a little bit about what it means to be writing in African futurism now, in this moment.
Yeah, good catch there. Good catch. Yeah, when I tweeted that was a very emotional moment for me. Writing in African futurism right now is, I'll just be honest, it feels lonely. It feels lonely. It feels like I'm constantly having to explain a story that I don't want to have to explain. You know, I feel like I'm a pretty good writer, and I'm pretty good at telling a story and setting the reader there without having to do all that. But it's like there are just certain aspects that just that have nothing to do with me. It has a lot to do with, in particular, American society, that where certain things, no matter how strongly and how colorfully and how well I say it, are not heard or viewed as significant. So yeah, that's what it feels. That's really what it feels like to be and mind you, I love writing this stuff. I mean, that I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it. I love it. I love telling the stories. The stories are intoxicating to me. They are just, they're just incredible. I love them. But it does feel, it definitely, I think if I had to use one word, I would say lonely. Yeah.
You mentioned this in the green room before. You were talking about, we asked you what sort of questions you wished you'd been asked when you give talks, and your answer was about a sort of isolation of writing, against traditions, against continents, and the ways in which people didn't ask you questions about Nigerian culture, about culture generally, or even about intertextual references, you know, which writers have influenced you.
Yeah.
Is that a part of the loneliness you were trying to express? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, definitely. It's like it's almost like you're speaking a different language, and you're being understood, but like parts of what you're saying are not being understood at all. And like there's a feel of not even being like not others not even being equipped to understand what you're saying because they can't make all the cross references, you know, like those general, like for example, in my novel Noor, you know, it's like I've seen it where they just want to explain it as a thriller. Yeah, fast-paced thriller, you know, all those familiar terms. And I'm like, you're missing the commentary about the Fulani herdsmen. You're missing, you know, which is a big thing if you have the context with that, and you're missing the context about this part of the world having, you know, dealing with these corporations and experimentation in Africa. Like you're just missing all that, and you're just glossing over it so that it sounds familiar to you. And I get that when something sounds familiar to you, you feel more comfortable. You can speak on it. You feel more confident in speaking on it, but you're also missing a lot. And I think that it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to get things wrong. It's okay, you know, but I think there's a general feel of, you know, it's just easier when it's familiar, because there aren't those pitfalls that you can, those things that you can just fall into and have to deal with your own mistakes, you know. So just stick with the familiar, and that's just it's safer. It's safer.
Let me ask one more sort of opening question, and then I'll start to get into the stuff that's in the Q&A from the audience members. Thinking about what you're saying now, and I really want to direct everyone to turn to your blog in the same way that you encouraged them to do. There's a short story that you put on your blog called "The Key," which is in many ways just read by itself a very moving story about a young girl who's attempting to avoid punishment and who sets herself on fire when she's thought to have lost something, only to discover after the fire has been put out that there's a gremlin beneath her bed that's been stealing her things. And then after this extraordinary story, which is haunting in its own right, at the bottom, you posted a link or a summary of the news story from 2002 that had moved you to write this, about a young girl who'd set herself on fire and died as a consequence to avoid punishment. You feel, I mean, that struck me, the tension between the story and the newspaper, and it felt like that was you trying to make legible the meaning of that short story beyond the gremlin.
Yeah. Like that story can be read surface, but there's deeper, like the inspiration of that story was much deeper. And it's short, it's quick, and you can miss it really easily. And I know that's why I had to put the link. I'm like, okay, I have to explain myself. I have to explain this, because if I don't, it's not going to be understood. And that news story about the girl, it's brief. It does mention her name, but I just feel like she's just forgotten. And I don't know, like whenever I would go, I just always noticed how they have, you know, a lot of homes they have house girls, and these girls would just be, they would do all the work, and they, and I don't know, they just needed, I've always felt like, even with my first novel, Zara the Windseeker, one of the things that made me write that novel was watching one of my cousins who was basically treated like a house girl. She was always working and cooking and cleaning and doing all the stuff, while her male cousins were playing video games. And that angered me so much. I wanted to write a story that would grab her so hard that she would go and hide and not do her chores. That was, so those, just the way a lot of times girls are, especially girls who are in poorer families, how they can be treated in Nigeria. I'm speaking about Nigeria. And it bothers me. And I just thought about this girl. I read this story and I'm like, this girl's name has been forgotten. It has been. You put her name in Google, nothing else comes up but that short news story that kind of was very dismissive. And I just wanted to empower her, like, in the only way I knew how. And so, like, I used that story to rewrite her ending. And that was, yeah. So that story was a lot heavier than it seems on the surface.
A lot of the people who are adding questions are wondering about influences and origin stories for the work that you're doing. So let me just ask about the story of Firdousi Bello, right? I believe I'm pronouncing her name correctly. Yeah. And I want to know how long you had to sit with that before you got a chance to express it in fiction.
I can't remember when I wrote that story, but I had that news article for a long time. I kept it. And like, I have like a file of things that just bother me, or that just hit me across the head. And I don't know what to do with them at the time, but I keep them. And I was looking through the file and I saw that story again. And I was like, oh, wait, what was this about again? And I saw it and I'm like, oh my God. And when it hit me, when I reread it, I'm like, I got to do something. So that was really, it was years. I actually had that story for years before I wrote that short story, but it bothered me for a long time. Yeah.
Sean, one of the guests who's watching, asks what inspired the Akata series, and I'm wondering if there's a story there too.
Yeah, there's a story there. So one of my mom's best friends was visiting, and she brought her daughter with her. She was visiting the United States. She was visiting us in the south suburbs of Illinois, and they were from Nigeria. They're Igbo, and she brought her daughter with her, and her daughter happened to have albinism. And her daughter Sandra she was like at the time she was like about 9 or 10, and she didn't want to hang out with her mom. She wanted to hang out with me, and so I spent the whole 2 weeks with her and got to know her really well. And by the time that 2 weeks was up, I knew, I'm like, okay, I want to write. She's my main character. And it's not because of her albinism at all. It was like her personality. She was tricky. She was very powerful minded, and just a really interesting person. And like, when it's rare that I can meet someone who becomes one of my characters. Like, my characters often come out of thin air most of the time. But if I meet someone who becomes one of my characters, that's always great, because it's easy. You just write her. So yeah, that was the origin of Sunny was Sandra. So like, there are aspects of it that were straight from what Sandra told me, like the being called Clorox, the discrimination that she dealt with in Nigeria, her loving candles, the hair catching fire. That was her story. She told me, she's like, I love candles, and I used to watch them, like, I used to gaze into them like TV. They were better than TV. And one day she had her big afro out, and she was gazing into the candle, and her hair caught fire, and she had to trim her hair. So, I mean, what writer would not hear something like that and not use it? So like, yeah, that was really where that came from. And then just and when it comes to like the premise of that book, it was going to the village, and like, the village, there's this mystical something, just to feel like it's just something. Like I knew, and like a lot of the stuff in Akata Witch, those are a lot of that. You'd be surprised at what I didn't make up. There's a lot that I did not, I like most of that stuff I did not have to make up. So a lot of that was just from those visits and things that I've just accumulated that we've talked about, like with my siblings forever. And yeah, that really led to the origin of that series.
You know, there's so many of the works that you've written have beautiful covers, just stunning covers that are shocking. And I think Akata Warrior actually won a prize for the cover. Vinny, one of our listeners, wonders about the adaptation of prose into imagery. And how do you work with a graphic artist or an artist generally to sort of visualize these people that are based on people you know? Turning these characters into an icon on the cover of a book or in a series.
Yeah, the artist who does most of my North American edition covers is Greg Ruth. Greg Ruth is awesome. Like Greg Ruth is his work is incredible. And like the first illustration that he did was the first Akata Witch, the paperback cover. That was the first one. And when he did that, like they wanted to have a different cover from the hardcover. And when I saw that image, I was like, oh my God, this white guy from Texas just finally drew my Igbo girl character with albinism. He drew her, and that's hard to like. It's a difficult balance to achieve, and he did it. And so when I saw that image, I was like, I want him to do all of my covers, all of them. I want him to do all of them. And that has been the case. And because his work is just amazing and gorgeous. And so from that first one, after that, we have like done this back and forth thing. So once we got to know each other, we started realizing that, oh man, his work would be even more amazing if we kind of collaborated on like the content part of it. Like if so he didn't just have to read the book. We would talk, we would go back and forth for a long time about who is this character? You know, what is it about her that stands out for you the most? Give me some imagery. So I'd send him a whole bunch of pictures, be like, okay, she look like her right here. And this, and there should be this here and this here. So we'd have like a whole conversation before he would render her. So all the images that you see for like Akata Warrior, Akata Woman, Book of Phoenix, the 10-year anniversary edition of Who Fears Death, Remote Control, I think those are Lagoon. I think it was the German edition of Lagoon. Like all of those are the result of conversations, you know, and that's like, the results is just amazing because he captures these characters. Like Remote Control was incredible. Like that's Sankofa. Like he did that. So it's a wonderful process. He's just amazing to work with, and it's a cool exercise for both of us that we just have this, you know, back and forth, and then we get to see the joint result.
Stylistically, he also captures your versatility as a writer because they don't all look as if they're produced by the same artist or about the same character. That's astonishing.
Yeah.
Is it hard to move into, I mean, because you're moving into a series with HBO and Hulu, and is it hard to work with like live actors who are performing the characters that you've written?
Yeah, we haven't gotten to that point yet. And I'm not looking forward to it.
Tell me why not.
it's the adaptation process is a lot. I will say that it's a lot. Who Fears Death has been more difficult for me. That one, and the main reason is because I'm not the one writing that, you know, and I'm not the one adapting it. And so I've learned what can happen when you're not the one adapting it. And that's been very difficult for me. Adapting Binti has been a joy. The story has expanded, and like, it's not even like this, it's already all there. It's just like being in the world and just looking around more and being able to put in more of what I see along with what's already there. So it's really, that one I'm very much looking forward to. There are two other ones that I'm working on that are being adapted, which I can't announce, but like those, same feeling with Binti. Who Fears Death was the first one that I had options, so it was a different, and I've learned a lot since then. I've also learned how to write a screenplay since then. I didn't know how to write one back then. But it's all a process. It's all a learning. It's all a really incredible learning experience. But yeah, there's a lot of letting go that has to happen. A lot of letting go, and I hold on to what George R. Martin is always pounding into my head. I will always have the books. Always have the book. It's always repeating that, which is true. Always have the books, because the adaptation is something else. It's I wouldn't say something else entirely, but it is something else.
How did you learn to write a screenplay, given you're so accomplished as a novelist? So that's a total change of genre.
Yes, it's completely different. It's completely different. It's completely different. I can't say that enough. It's a completely different process. I've learned on the fly. Like there are other projects that I have done that I also can't announce, but they're at different levels of just different levels. So I co-wrote the pilot for Binti with a very established writer, Stacey Asie Kufer, who has written for Watchmen, for example, and then she's writing the Marvel movie Blade. Right. So she's accomplished. So we co-wrote that. So as we co-wrote it, like when I say co-wrote, I mean really co-wrote, like it's both of us. And so I learned a lot of structural stuff from her in the process, which is really hard. It's hard to learn it as you're doing it. It's difficult, but there was that. And then there are also other experiences that I've had where I've learned by working and collaborating with other people. And so I've learned enough, and I've done that enough times. I've actually done it several times now, like several times, where I've learned enough where I can write my own now. You know, I can write my own. I've written my first screenplay for a feature film, and I've written my first pilot draft, multiple drafts now. But like, yeah, so I've done that. But it was over a period of time where like with different capacities of working with others, and then hearing back from producers, getting the notes and learning that way. So it's been cat. Okay. It's been, there we go. It's been a lot. Yeah. Yeah. And it's an interesting way. It's like learning by being right in the middle of it, which is tough. Yeah.
We knew the cats would make an appearance.
Yeah, I knew it, but they've been good so far. They've been good, and he didn't step on the keyboard, so there you go. Hi, meow, meow, meow. Okay, go.
Let me change this up a little bit. You once said in an interview that you love dystopian fiction because you love to see the world destroyed. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
Oh, that sounds awful, but it's the truth. It's the truth. I don't know. I love seeing the world destroyed. I don't know. There's something about seeing it all broken and fall apart. It's not, I mean, part of it is this idea of, okay, something has to come afterwards. You know, it's a clean slate, so something has to come afterwards. But also there's just the part of, so like there's post-apocalyptic and then there's apocalyptic. The apocalyptic part is fascinating because you just see all these things that, you know, that we've built, that we've messed up, that we've been successful at creating, like, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all of it. And then just to see it all just there, it's like in seeing it all fall apart, I still see the significance of it. So it's like there's a lesson in that even if it doesn't last, even if it's gone, it's still significant. And there's a comfort in that idea. I think that's getting at, you know, my fascination with it. Yeah.
I remember in the interview that you commented specifically on the moment in every disaster film when the camera pans around the world and we see everything fall apart. and then there's a kind of stale shot of Africa without much changing. And so
Yeah.
in a way, that was part of what was motivating my question.
Yeah, yeah. I like wait to see that done well. I think Futurama did it well once. They're like, I don't remember what episode, but in Futurama, they showed the Maasai, reacting just like everyone else. I was like, yes, finally, someone got it right. But yeah, most of the time, it's just like, it's sort of an unconscious commentary on what is considered the world, and that what is considered the world very often does not include the continent of Africa, which is really messed up.
I can't help but hear an implicit admiration of N.K. Jemison's work in what you're describing, your love of the apocalyptic. And because she describes a world that's constantly apocalyptic. Yeah. And I'm thinking about whose writing inspires you today. I mean, your writing is so inspiring, but you also described yourself as a voracious reader. So I'm curious.
Yeah, it's like, whose writing inspires me today? I don't know. I couldn't say anyone specific, because it's like, a lot of times I'll just pick stuff up randomly. And I'm all over the place with my reading. I'm like all over the place. I'm reading nonfiction stuff. I'm reading, I'll read, I love memoir, I love the practice of memoir. I'm reading, scientific stuff, it's Carl Sagan stuff, like just for the vibe of it, just for the vibe. So I'm just kind of all over the place. I don't know. And I find inspiration in random moments, like, I wouldn't say random, but like unexpected moments. I really couldn't say like any specific writer inspires me, because it's just like, it's like my reading is incredibly chaotic and weird and would make no sense. Like if I said the things that I've read in like the last month, it would be an embarrassment of weirdness. Like I'll pick up stuff at random and just start reading it, because I don't want to be guided by myself in this way. Like if I'm guided by myself, I always end up reading the same type of thing. So sometimes I was teaching my daughter to do this, that we just go to the library and just pick something. You don't look at it, you just like, okay, pick that thing and then borrow the book and go read it. And sometimes it takes you places that are extremely unexpected, that you never would have gone if you hadn't been there randomly. So that's really what my reading is like.
Musab in the Q&A has asked what your favorite part of writing is. And I want to also ask you what your favorite part of reading is.
I'll answer the reading thing first. Favorite part of reading is when something kicks into the zone. Like it kicks you into the, where everything falls away. Yeah. And you are not there. And this is just delicious. Like it's just, I don't know how else to describe it. It's delicious when you're reading the thing, and it's just delicious. And then even when you close the book, all you want to do is go back to it. And it takes over everything. You don't care about watching anything on TV. All you're thinking about is, okay, when am I going to crack the book open? If I'm reading that book while I'm eating, that is a good book. That is, that feeling, that trance-like feeling where you're just somewhere else is the best part of reading. I love it. I love it. And I can never predict when it's going to happen, but when it does, I'm like, yes. So there's that. Writing, I think that, it might be when I've written something and I'm rereading it and I'm just like, whoa, this is really, because a lot of times I write stuff where I'm not even, it's like I'm not even there, just writing something. I don't even remember writing it. And so then I'll come back to it the next day, or I usually don't read it the next day. I'll write like 100, 200 pages before I'll even read what I've written. That's, I just keep going. I just keep going and let it come. And I don't judge what I'm writing. But when I go back to reread it after I've cleaned up all the typos and made it, where I can read the thing, when I sit down and reread it and I fall into it, that's probably one of my favorite moments of writing. Like, it's like you're reading it like it's new and it's not yours, and it's really cool.
There's something about the way that you're describing reading and writing that reminds me of the way that you described playing tennis, that sensation of treeing. And a lot of your characters also have this kind of, you use the word obsessive a couple of times. I mean, do you find yourself looking for these moments of incredible emotional saturation and then writing your characters that way too?
I think so. I think it's something that, like, I didn't consciously do it, but like I crave that, that deep emotional, that deep emotional resonance. I love writing that. Like, it can be really difficult and painful, but yeah, I keep coming back to it. Like, I mean, in Remote Control, that beginning, where that happens, I keep coming back to that kind of moment. It's not that I enjoy it, but I think I do, which is yucky about that. But yeah, there's something like getting in there, and it just feels, there's no other way to describe it, so I'll just say there's a vibration there. Like, there's a heavy vibration there that I really get into. And it happens in Noor. It happens in all of my works. Like, I'm always attracted to those moments. Yeah.
Do you write on one book at a time? Do you work on multiple books at a time? I mean, given what you're describing, I imagine one book at a time, but I don't want to just let that sit there without asking.
Yeah, it's I have multiple projects at a time. I can write multiple screenplays at a time. I've had to, but that's like, you have to, because you get the rewrites and all that stuff, whatever. It's a different intensity. Novels, however, one novel at a time. Like, one novel at a time. It's still, even with all the projects that I'm doing, it can only be one novel at a time. It is too intense. Like, writing a novel is way too intense to do more than one at a time. Like, I can't, even just thinking about it now, it's like, oh my God. I can't even, nope. I mean, there are ideas that I have, and I the ideas that I have now, but there's a novel I'm working on now, and there is no way I can work on anything else, like any other novel right now, just that one. Yeah.
When we were in the green room, we were joking about the giant spiders that are making their way up the East Coast, and about your lifelong love of spiders in a way. And I'm just wondering, what is the connection between your interest in etymology and your right? It's an odd question to ask, but there has to be some sort of connection, and I'm sure you've figured it out.
I have not, but I think about it often. Because, like, I'm obsessed with spiders. I'm terrified of spiders. Like, I will hold a giant grasshopper. I will grab, I grab grasshoppers. That's what I do. If they're grasshoppers out there, and they're like the humongous kind. I love katydids. I love cicadas. They, hold the cicada. That thing can make you go deaf. If you get those ones that are really noisy, they can make you go deaf. And I love them, like the humongous bugs. I love them, but I cannot carry a spider. I can't. Like, I just can't. Maybe one of those little tiny jumping spiders, maybe, but I'd have to strain. There's just something about them. But I'm also like, I'm obsessed with, and this is kind of linked to the writing. I'm obsessed with the things that I fear. So, like, I'm terrified of spiders, but I'm obsessed with it. There's something about them that fascinates me. Like, I was talking to my daughter, I'm like, I would get a tattoo of a spider, but it would be on my back where I can't see it. I can't see it. But like, they're really, in a lot of ways, I have a deep connection to them in some strange way, that there's fear, but there's awe and fascination. And So I'm constantly, there's a book of spiders when I was little that I would read all the time, despite the fact that I could barely touch the pages. I was reading it. But like when it comes to the insect world, I don't know, the insect world is small. And, you know, I grew up around this empty lot. There was an empty lot when we were in South Holland. There were like houses were just being built. So there are a lot of empty lots around that they're all gone now, completely gone. But you had these empty lots that are filled with weeds and plants. And so in the summer, those places would be teeming with things. And I would just traipse in there and catch things. And I came to understand there were worlds in that empty lot, that tiny empty lot. There are worlds in there. Things happening, like rising and falling, and just things happening in there. And these small, and so I think the idea of insect, and I love microbiology as well. So the small worlds and empires, they're small, but there's so much happening. I think there's something about that. There's something about that. And then there's also the foreignness of insects. If you look at insects really closely, they're just so strange and so different from us, but they're just so amazing as well. And so it's I think it's all of those things. It's all of those things.
And there are, I mean, you can see how the sort of life structure or social worlds of insects appear in your novels in a number of ways. Like you're clearly trying to make a connection between the insect world you once studied in that lot,
yeah,
the speculative worlds that you're building in literature.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They're the Nnedi script series. That's one place where I'm like, oh, I could put all the bugs in here. I could put all the bugs in here. Like there's the ghost hopper, which is like basically wishful thinking for me. Ghost hopper is like this ghost giant, like a foot, the size of a football grasshopper. It's bright red and it's pretty and chunky. I love big grasshoppers. And it's like, it's just in your house. You know, it's just in your house. And if it senses that you're unhappy or depressed, it sings the song to you. So it's just, you know, and then there's the artist wasp. There's a whole thing behind how I came up with the artist wasp. It was just, and that it was also linked to a wasp that I saw in Nigeria, but it's also linked to the Pepsis wasp, the tarantula hawk, which basically is this humongous, it has the most painful sting in the world. And it's found here in Phoenix, and I've seen them.
Of course, yeah.
I've seen them, and so that one looks like it looks the wasp in the wasp artist looks exactly like the Pepsis wasp. So like there's all sorts of ways where because insects do some magical stuff. You know, they do some stuff like if you really study some of these insects, they have exploding ants. They're like suicide bomber ants that like they'll explode for the sake of the colony. You know, that's just one example. Insects are just magical in their own right. So it's like that transition is not hard into the speculative. It's not difficult when it comes to insects.
At the same time, you know, one of the driving themes of your work has to be home. And given your emphasis on identity, on movement, on hybridity and borders, you know, lots of people seem to ask you, you know, what is home? And I kind of want to change that question a little bit and ask you why home matters. Like, why does home matter now? Why does home matter in your fiction?
Yeah. Home matters. I think I'm the child of immigrants. So it's always been that question of where is home? What is home? And understanding that home moves and that home can be in multiple places at the same time. Understanding that you can easily not understand your home. You know, like it's so that the idea in this home and identity those are things that I have that are central to me, like, because I live on so many different borders. You know, and I'm a specific type of Nigerian American. You know, I identify both as American and Nigerian, and I also don't identify as either. I also am in conversation with both, and I am in argument with both and in conflict with both. So it's this idea of what is home, and that feeling, and my siblings and I, we talk about this a lot of not having a home. And the Binti deals with this. This is like something that I rarely get asked about with Binti. Like Binti deals with like that whole trilogy is all about home. It's all about home. And the ending of Binti, of the trilogy, is my idea about home. Like it literally is. Because, you know, I don't want to give away the ending, but if for those of you who've read it, there's something that happens that is an example of what I'm talking about. I can't say it because it's like literally the ending, but and even the second Binti book is Binti Home. You know, this idea of she leaves, like the premise of Binti is that this girl goes to the finest university in the galaxy. She leaves a very cultural home, a happy home, because she wants to she wants this knowledge. She wants to go to this university. She leaves. If this were the typical narrative, she'd never go back home again. You know, the typical narrative is, oh, she leaves and she becomes something else over there. And she sheds her cultural old school ways. She sheds them and becomes, you know, super cool Binti. That's the typical narrative that you see. But for Binti, that's not the case. She goes and has her experience, but she comes home. There's a reason why this narrative goes home. And when she comes home, she goes deeper into who she is, even deeper by going home. She learns a lot by going out into space, but she learns even more by coming home. So yeah, the theme of home is really, it's a complicated one, a complex one. It's a conversation I'm constantly having. And it all comes down to, like, you know, me being, you know, the child of immigrants, but also I'm in conversation, active conversation with it, voluntary conversation with the idea. And it continues. There's no answer. It's just like you just continue moving through it and learning and shifting, and yeah.
Providence is the birthplace of H.P. Lovecraft. And I remember that you and Daniel Jose Older had petitioned to replace Lovecraft's visage with that of Octavia Butler. And we have several questions here in the chat about literary fiction and science fiction and genre defining contributions. And I'm just wondering what you feel like the state of science fiction is these days on this exact question.
Yeah. First, you know, it wasn't me who petitioned for that. That was Daniel. For me, because I'm very much, I like to open up conversations. And I didn't want to, like, because like I actually started that whole conversation. It was me who started it, because when I won the World Fantasy Award and I was presented with the head of H.P. Lovecraft, whom I knew who he was. I just didn't know, like, and I knew that he had some issues. I didn't know the depth of it. You know, I didn't know the depth of it. And, you know, I love Stephen King. So that was what led me to being curious about Lovecraft before I won that award, but I didn't know the depth of it. So get this bust. And then a friend of mine, and I'm like, oh, look at it. Isn't this cool? And he looks at it. He's like, that's H.P. Lovecraft. I'm like, yeah. And then he showed me, he's like, let me show you something. Then he shows me that poem, the creation of the, yeah. And I was like, okay. And I knew when I saw that I had to say something. You know, I'm like, okay, this needs to be discussed. This needs to be, that was my reaction was, this needs to be discussed. I didn't think this needs to be changed. I'm like, because for me, I always felt like that's not my place. You know, I'm going to bring the conversation, and I'm going to point this out, and then I'm going to step back and let the conversation happen, and whatever happens, happens. So, and so that when I wrote a blog post about it, and that blog post got more circulation than I expected. You know, I was surprised. It did start a conversation, and I was glad, because that was what I wanted to do. I wasn't really into replacing the award with anybody. I don't think the award should be a human being. I think it should, I don't think it's, you know, so that wasn't really my thing. That was Daniel's thing. But then years later, he started pushing for that. And then it just, eventually the bust was changed. But that wasn't my asking. I didn't ask for it. I just presented the information and presented how I felt, and then whatever happens, great. To answer the question about the state of science fiction today, I don't know. I mean, I know that things are more, there are conversation, there's more room for conversation. There are conversations that are being had, and that's always a thing for me. I like for things, there are rarely any answers to these things, but I do like for there to be conversation. I think the answers are in the conversation, so since those things are happening, I'm glad. I think that, I've been around long enough where I've seen things shift, where like if you were telling this kind of narrative a few years ago, like in 2005, like people really had no context and didn't know how to even take anything that was outside of the cultural norm, which was basically white and male for a while. I know Octavia Butler was around, but they were whitewashing her covers too, and all of that. I think things have come a long way. I think there are more perspectives. I think that we're hearing more stories and more perspectives now. I think that we have a ways to go. But I've got my head down. I'm like writing stories, so I'm not really like taking the pulse of how are things right now in science fiction. I don't pay attention to a lot of that. I'm interested when I see things that come across my table, where I'm like, oh, that's cool. But I couldn't really comment on, like, in general, how do I pull it all together, because I'm not really paying attention, if that makes sense.
No, it totally does. There are a number of young people who are watching us here, and many of them aspire to be novelists or writers or creators of some kind. And I'm just wondering what you might want to say to them in this last moment of our conversation here today. What do you want them to take away from your work and your life story and where we are here today?
Yeah, I think that the confidence in knowing your own work is good, like not needing the gratification of, because we're in a instant gratification world now with social media, and other people's opinions matter. Other people's opinions matter, but yours should matter more. Like what you think, what you feel, what you want to see, that's what should matter. Just like, don't pay attention to all the noise. Like for me, I knew my stuff was good because I knew my stuff was good. I didn't need publishers, I didn't need people, I didn't need anyone telling me it was good. And in having that internal confidence, I was able to write the type of work that I wasn't seeing. I didn't have anything, there was nothing I could compare what I was writing to. Like, I couldn't be like, oh, this is already there, so maybe I can do it now. I didn't have that. So that had to come from within. And so, like, if you're gonna, like, if you've got stories to tell, don't worry about what's already out there, and don't look at other people's paths and all of that. Just do your thing and do what you love and enjoy. That's like a big part of it. Enjoy what it is that you write. And also, and I always say that, like, reading is just as important as writing. So, like, because if you don't know that feeling of joy when you're reading something wonderful, you're not going to be able to do it. So, like, you got to know, like, the two go hand in hand. So yeah, I think that if there's one thing to take away from what I've said, is like that confidence in your own story. And I'm not saying that you should be like, oh, I'm just so awesome. Like, not like that. You're going to have those voices that are going to be telling you what you're writing is terrible. That's normal. You just keep going. You just keep going. It's easier to work with something than nothing. And that's what editing is for. That's what editing is for. So spill the thing out and enjoy yourself in the process, and know that it's good, and then see what happens.
Dr. Nnedi Okorafor, it has been my honor and my pleasure to engage you in conversation today. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
And
my pleasure.
I speak for everyone when I say I can't wait to see what you do next. So.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This has been great.